Good morning, everyone. So we'll go right in. Obviously, in 20 minutes, we can't nail all the mega trends that are out there or figure out how to solve all of them. But the idea here was just more to get us thinking and start to think about how, as businesses, we respond to some of those big mega trends that we see impacting on our business. So just in case you don't know who we are, I thought I'd have one slide about Welcome to Cranfield. So we're quite a unique university. We don't have any undergraduates. We're strictly postgrad, and we sit in the middle of a field in Bedfordshire, and that's where the campus is, and that's where we do all our work. But we're very well known in the areas that we work in, and we do a lot of research, and we engage a lot with industry. So hopefully some of you have crossed paths with us. More specifically, I am part of the Center for Logistics and Supply Chain Management at Cranfield, and it is one of those areas where Cranfield is recognized as a global leader in what we teach and the research that we do and the engagement that we have with industry. So you just see some nice bits of information there, and we've been doing it for over 35 years. So we have a long history, and we have obviously evolved, like all of us, over that time in what we focus on and what we do. So now if we can then focus in more on some of the global trends. I put this up because I think we often see them and we just perceive the risk. But often there's also the potential for an opportunity. And it's how do we, one, identify the risks that those changes can bring, how do we mitigate those risks, but then also how do we turn it around and potentially make it into an opportunity for our businesses. In everything that I say, I think triple bottom line, because I think for most businesses now, if you are just focused on how to make more profit or how to make more money, that probably you're going to run into trouble with different stakeholders in your supply chain. So I do think that more and more we see businesses really starting to think more across the triple bottom line. Some people call it people, planet, profit. Others call it, the social, environmental, and economic dimensions. But again, what you see forward-thinking companies doing is taking a more holistic view of their organization and their supply chain and actually considering all three dimensions as they make decisions on how they position, grow their supply chain, and what they do. So if we look at one of the first global megatrends that was referenced earlier, is this global warming and the major climatic events that we're seeing occurring more frequently, all linked to climate change. So, impact on my supply chain is really starting to think about, well, have you really looked at your global supply chain, and have you done your supply chain risk assessment and started to identify your mitigation strategies for specific risks that you identify in your supply chain? Have you considered where you locate your suppliers? So we have had organizations come to us to say, okay, we're looking at developing a new supplier for let's say this particular product. Where would you suggest that we do that? Because where we are currently, we know is already in a water-stressed area, and where would be the best place for us to look in the future for 20 years from now that we secure the supply of our supply into us, because it's key for our business. So where would you advise us to look to source from or to establish suppliers? So you're seeing businesses starting to think about making long-term decisions, strategic decisions around how they build that supply chain in response to some of these challenges that we see. Long-term food security and securing your supply, for me, are two very important things. So as businesses, again, you see a lot of the big multinationals going all the way back up in their supply chain, working with farmers across a wide footprint, because they're concerned about securing the supply of those raw materials coming into their business. So coffee, cocoa are good examples where you see multinationals actually collaborating with their competitors to actually ensure and drive better practices on their farmers in those distant countries to ensure their supply longer term. So I think more holistically, companies are starting to think about how is our supply chain impacting not just here in my home nation, but globally, because with social media and with all the technology now, it's very hard to behave in one way somewhere else and not expect that it's going to impact on you in your operating countries, let's say in Europe. Another one, air pollution, urbanization, restrictions on transport. If we just look at London, okay, there's a lot of talk around the air pollution in London. What we're seeing globally are megacities, big cities with over 10 million people in it. And if you are supplying into those megacities, then it requires a whole rethink of how you structure your logistics and your distribution going into those megacities. How do you ensure, so if you're Marks and Spencer's food, I always talk about, I love Marks and Spencer's food. I love most things, but that when I'm traveling, that there's always the hoisin duck wrap, at that M&S food station in St. Pancras that I can pick up to take on the Eurostar. Now that's incredibly challenging, and as the cities get bigger, you have cities now that are bigger than some countries. I grew up in the Caribbean, so pretty much most cities are bigger than where I grew up. But that brings with it special challenges, especially if then you have things like, you can't take big trucks in, you have charges if you go in certain hours. So the concept of how businesses, again, are starting to think about and working with their third-party logistics providers and some of their competition to actually ensure product on shelf for when people want to buy it. Things like vertical and urban farming. I haven't been there yet, but in some disused subway tunnels in London, there are companies growing herbs and certain vegetables that then are supplying fresh into some of the restaurants in that area. So things like vertical and urban farming is again starting to be developed in some countries around the world. So China is very involved in this, and you see even in the US, lots of those big cities starting to look at those types. Not that it's going to replace, but it's an opportunity to do something different. And it's an opportunity where you see, so we have LED guys here, LEDs were one of the big breakthroughs that allow us to do some of these things. So what you're seeing is the innovation coming across very different sectors that can have a big impact on how we approach some of these problems that we have. The last one there I'll just mention is incentivizing people to stay on the farms. Okay? The average age of farmers worldwide is going up because the young generation is not so keen to stay on the farms. They're all moving to the bright lights of the big city. Well, how do we engage with those young people because we need the farmers to actually supply us the raw materials for most of the products that we produce. And so again, working with those communities to incentivize the farmers, improve the productivity, and encourage new people to get into those farming roles is absolutely critical. And again, you see big business working very proactively with the farming communities that they depend on to make sure that that continues. So another one, water stress and failed harvests. Again, the example I gave earlier of the company that was looking to shift longer term or develop suppliers in areas that, because their current suppliers are in water-stressed areas. So they were proactively starting to think about how do we develop suppliers in different places. But food fraud. Are we proactively scanning? Because we know some of the drivers behind food fraud. If we're not paying enough, or if, last year we know the olive harvest was not its best in Southern Europe. So should we be looking ahead, really, and thinking we should be testing for blended? Because if we can still buy the same amount of extra virgin pure olive oil, then maybe something in our heads and in our system should be setting off a little alarm saying, hang on, is that really possible? Should we be more proactive? And again, whether horse meat was one of the ones that drove people, but you see people tapping into big data sources, open data, and trying to identify the precursors that they're picking up on problems that could lead to issues in their supply chain, or people starting to think about substitution or different things that you would want to protect yourself and your brand from. Population growth, changing consumer demands. Okay, we need to produce more. We're tired of hearing it. We're going to be 9 billion by 2030. We need more food. We need to waste less food. But those are very practical things that we can look at. And I think R&D has a role in there. And even looking at how we manage our supply chain. So in developing countries, we have more food waste at the farm level. In developed countries, it's at the consumer level. So how do we work across those complex supply chains that we're part of to actually address the different problems there? You see a growth in the numbers of short supply chains. Will it ever replace the big global supply chains and the global manufacturers? Probably not. But I think what you're seeing is that we're looking to develop, and the parallel is there with nature, a more diverse ecosystem. Because to make the system more robust to shocks in the system, to make us more resilient, we probably need a blend. We need that diverse ecosystem. We need some short supply chains. We maybe need some, vertical farming. We still need the big guys. We need all of those things to actually work seamlessly together to ensure that we're more resilient to shocks to our food systems. I don't say it here, but, again, sugar tax legislation, there's a lot of external obesity and things like that where you see governments, health systems pushing back on the manufacturers to drive the change. So they're controlling our consumer choices because they see the cost to the systems. So we have a lot of things impacting on the food system as a whole that we need to figure out what's doing. The changing retail landscape, so certainly in the UK, you have your Aldi and your Lidls. You have your, Amazon now delivering food. You have to the door deliveries of, you have, what's it called, fresh. They supply the meal for you, so there are all sorts of different channels and ways, routes to market that you're seeing popping up that are very interesting, again, to explore. Aging population, here's the obesity. But at the same time, we might be obese, but a lot of people are also malnourished. And so, again, you see some of the big companies branching, almost crossing with food and pharmaceuticals, where they're bringing this customized food, specialized diets into the mainstream. And I think I've spoke about these other things already. Just a whole long list of some generic ones: child labor, modern-day slavery, bribery. We had Tesco a few years ago really caught out with their shrimp supply chain. But in fairness to Tesco, it was so far back. Most companies are not actually having the visibility or auditing, all the way back so far in their supply chain. And at the same time, what you see is that when you do get caught, it becomes a big deal. I think, again, technology, cloud technology, some of those things are starting to give us easier ways to get better visibility across our whole supply chain. But it is very complex. And I don't think there are simple solutions to this, but I think more and more we're seeing organizations having to start to think about these things. Internet of Things, I'm sure a lot of us are wearing some sort of smart technology on us, wearable technology, whether it's a Fitbit, it's a smartwatch, something. And more you're seeing some really cool and innovative ideas about communicating even with your consumers, because often as the manufacturers, there was this retailer between you and your consumer. And actually this technology of Internet of Things and some of those technologies are actually enabling us to, if you like, leapfrog over that and start to communicate directly with our consumers in new and novel ways. But that's a very simple example, but there's so many ways that businesses can leverage some of these technologies in improving their supply chain and across their whole business. I'm not going to talk about it, but it wouldn't be right if I didn't just put that word up there and just remind us that Brexit does mean Brexit, and that's all I can say about it because I don't know much more at this point, okay? But it is going to be a challenge for food sector, okay? Who is going to do the harvest first if we can't depend on some of the Eastern Europeans who do it for us so well? There's so many implications for the food sector that I think this is something that as a sector, we need to be very proactive in engaging with the government to understand how we're going to solve some of the big issues that we have. So those were the mega trends, and I just thought I'd mention a couple of little things, because again, what you hear all the time, and it's probably it was certainly in some of the earlier presentations, everybody's saying, oh, collaboration is the answer. Guess what? Collaboration is really hard to do, because it's easy to say, but the reality of it is quite difficult. And so we were involved in a large project looking at improving the logistics of food supply chains, and what Cranfield really developed, and it didn't just apply to logistics, was something we call collaboration for sustainability, which again brings in the triple bottom line that I keep talking about. And it provides sort of a structured approach to actually stepping a network of organizations through the process of setting up a collaborative initiative, because it's not so easy. It's not just the big guy, the power broker in the supply chain, now you guys will collaborate, we're going to do X, Y, Z, everybody's going to play along. It does not work that simply, okay? Because where you get real collaboration and really big step changes in what we do is where people actually all get something from the project. So we have a framework that we have that we can step through to start to articulate very early on what the different stakeholders want to get from the collaboration, and then actually a grown-up discussion about, okay, we might want all these 10 things, but okay, just 3 of them are going to go in, are going to be core to this project. Let's focus on this, and maybe we come back to those once we get more experience with this. So it's just something that we've developed. It's available. If you are interested, we have a few printed copies on our stand, but we also have them all as PDF in English, French, Spanish, and Dutch, which if you email us, we can always send you the PDF to it. The last thing I wanted to talk about was supply chain risk, because again at Cranfield, we have done a lot of work looking at risk in supply chains. Because fundamentally, risk, if you can identify your risk and understand it and work to mitigate it, then ultimately you end up with a more resilient supply chain, which is what we want, something that is able to respond and adapt to shocks in the system. And so some years ago, there's a lot of, don't worry, you can't read all of this, but what we did is we took a very generic, if you like, food supply chain and just stepped through and started to pull out what would be some of the sources of risk, or some of the things that we would be looking at if we wanted to be more sustainable across the triple bottom line. What would be some of those things? Obviously, not all of those may be relevant to every company, and we don't have the full list of things here. There will be some that are not here. And so, but the key thing is that as businesses, if we are not sitting with our management team and mapping out our supply chain and identifying where is the risk in our supply chain, then, you know, that's dare I say it, that's a really risky thing to do. So it's really important that you start working with your teams and don't just focus on the UK part. Most of us are part of global supply chains. So let's look globally. Because if we don't understand where the risk is in our supply chains, and so there are different ways that you can do this, and then you can rank them and multiply, and you get risk priority numbers. But one thing that we talk about is, because often we have, when we do the assessment of risk, we may have something that has a very high impact, but it just happens very infrequently. So we never think about it. But because they're starting to happen, so earthquake in New Zealand, massive impact, but maybe they had it at a higher level, but there would be other things where we don't rank something too high. But what we're saying now in supply chain, if you have something that would have a major impact, even if the likelihood of it is quite low, you should just think about it, because the mean time to recovery of your supply chain, if that were to happen, could be very long and cause significant disruption to your supply chain. So again, all I can say is that you should hopefully be starting to think about where is the risk in your supply chain, and step out of the traditional things we think about, you know, because there's so many new risks coming in to the food sector that we should be considering as we look at our businesses. And so just to end, just to reiterate, hopefully you are well prepared and you've looked at your supply chain to mitigate the risk, but at the same time, as I said at the very beginning, there's a lot of opportunity as well. there are opportunities there for us to differentiate, for us to do new things. And so with that, I'll just say, if you need help, you can come talk to us. We're a university. We're always happy to engage with businesses and work with you on trying to solve some of these problems. So if you are interested in anything that I spoke about or in talking with us, we have a stand just around the corner. Come find us. Thank you very much, everyone.